Chapter 1. The Age of They made of relief. What made the maze so what words? So dangerous, so words the relate the Middle Ages. That the Middle Ages, broad speeds, the broad span of Spanish fan of the fall and trace from the fall of the West Roman Empire in the 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance were not simply a period of political fragmentation and intellectualness. Spells is sometimes suggested they were an era of genuine civilization, of cathedral building and university founding, innovate and cultivated build itself as the sophisticated achievement. Still astonishes us today, but they were also an era of a specific and terrible kind of vulnerability. A vulnerability that made every disaster, every bad harvest, a bad harvest, every of disease, every military contingency into potentially existential in a way that the inhabitants of the modern developed world can barely imagine. Consider the basic conditions of perhaps 90% the population of Europe were peasants who grew their own food on small plots of land using techniques that had changed little since the Roman period. Their margin narrow, a good harvest and a small surplus for trade. A bad harvest meant hunger. Two bad harvests in session meant famine, and death on a scale that modern people encounter only a developing world. There was no welfare state, no internet system. Stockpile of emergency food reserves maintained by government against the possibility of catastrophe. When disaster struck a community, it does, but it accumulated with self. It's in the modern sense. Medieval physicians were intelligent and often observant, but they operated in a theoretical the four Hellenic medicine. That medicine That gave them no understanding. Diseases spread. They could not identify the epidemic. Developed treatments and conduit a modern outbreak. When plague arrived in a medieval city, in all the days of and flight, as we shall, I think, often spread the disease rather than containing it. The disaster of the marriages. Catastrophes. They were catastrophes that stressed society, the specifics of vulnerabilities, agricultural, medical, political, and psychological that amplified their impact in ways that would not have occurred in society. Understanding these disasters means understanding just the events themselves, but the world they struck. It struck its fragilities, its strengths. Well, it's for both suffering and recovery. Chapter 12. Death. The bladeth. The greatest scale is of death and in the birth of Devon. 1347, 4347, T47, 37, Tier 4047, a 12 Genoese trading ship arrived at Messina at the port of Sicily after of Kaffa on the Black Sea. The harbor master, who met the fleet, immediately ordered it back out to sea. The sailors on board were dying, their bodies, covered with swellings in the heads and groin, oozing blood and pus. The skin darkened with internal hemorrhage. This hemorrhage smelled to be unbearable, but the order came too late. The rats that already reached the shore, and with them the fleas that carried Yersinia parasitoides, the bacterium that would kill in the following 6 years. In the flare entire of Europe, the Black Death not news used by history as was not a European phenomenon in isolation. It was a global pandemic whose origins is evidence some major outbreak occurred in the Kyrgyzstan It is now Kyrgyzstan. In Kyrgyzstan in 1838 and 38 and 1339, 1339 and 38, preserved in the unusual lake river of Players period. That period. From Central Asia, it traveled from the Mongol Empire, reaching the Crimean Parafa, a Genoese trading post. By 1846, the Mongol army besieging Kaffa. But a day that it stayed by Wilkes catapulted corpses over the city walls in what may be first in warfare. The Genoese defenders fled by sea, carrying the ports to the Mediterranean. The speed and thoroughness, the view moved through Europe in 1347 to 1353, and that frame 1553 remains 53, remains staggering. Even historians the epidemic disease. From Sicily, it reached mainland Italy by the end of 47. Florence and most sophisticated cities in Europe lost between thirds of its population in the summer of 1348. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived and set the frame of Cameron in a villa outside Florence, where young people abundant is Zedin. The streets, this lets the dead in the streets, the lying in the streets, the collapse of conventions, the abandonment of the sick by their families, always cemeteries, the mass graves dug, the city walls, the mechanics mess as destiny, all kinds of Mesopotamians, only faith of presence, but of delay, but killing bubonic beads. Bubonic plague, the most common form, was transmitted by the bites of fleas that had fed and its other rodents. It produced the characteristic buzzing, swollen, painful, in the groin, armpit, or neck, along with high fever, delirium, and physical collapse. Without treatment, approximately half of those infected with the bubonic form died, typically within the 7 days of the first symptoms. pneumonic plague spread through respiratory respirates from person to person to person, attacked the lungs, and was almost always fatal within 2 or 3 days. Septicemic plague, in which bacterium and which killed good times and symptoms. Develop the psychological impact of an epidemic. It's this speed. On this and we reconstruct from the historical record, because was it all the disasters of the disaster. The records that survive are fragmentary, often written by people who were themselves traumatized, and they reflect a range of responses that historians have found remarkably consistent across different regions and cultures. Initial denial and incomprehension, desperate, religious response as and divine protection, followed by many temporary observed as a collapse of normal moral and social behavior as it became clear that neither prayer nor medicine nor any human dying could the search for explanations and to consequence of the Black Death, the theory that Jews had Jews, that the epidemic was the result of deliberate contamination rather than divine judgment or natural cause. Through the German-speaking world with a speed and thoroughness that reflected both the desperation of people seeking an explanation for the inexplicable and anti-Semitic prejudice that made Jews scapegoat. In Basel, Strasbourg, Freiburg, and Van dozens in cities, Jewish community recognized Wallitzer, whose horror was recognized as unjustifiable even by some temporaries, including Pope Clemencies, issued papal bulls condemning the persecution, the demographic impact, combined with the mortality Flask, catastrophic communities, speaking world, the aftermath, a world of a remedied wave, the first great wave of blood grave. Freight Black Death finally subsided. Europe had lost between 1/3 and 60% of its population. The precise figure varied enormously by region, with some and others and others for reasons that are still suffering much lower mortality. The population of Europe, estimated at approximately 75 million in 34 and 40 and 40, had fallen to somewhere around 50 million by 1400. Odd for 200. It would not recover to pre-big levels until well into the 16th century, nearly the initial outbreak. The social and economic consequences of telegraphic imperfection were profound. In some respect paradoxical. The sudden and extreme label of agricultural workers and craftsmen who survived. Giving the black had never previously possessed. The black as lords who forced us to offer better terms, had previously required. The disruption of established institutions. The church, the nobility, the universities created spaces for new ideas and new social arrangements that over the century would contribute intellectual and cultural ferment of the Renaissance. The plague did not come only once. After the initial catastrophic wave of 47 to 47 to Weigerton and were 353 planted in successive waves. In 1361, in 1369, in 1369, in 1374, and repeatedly throughout the remainder of the 14th and 15th centuries. Each subsequent wave was generally smaller than the first. Of the population died, and as reduced in transmission, but each wave still gave the cumulative devastations was to keep European population levels depressed for generations, and generations, and to maintain a pervasive consciousness of death as an immediate, real presence in everyday life. Up, chapter 3. The Great Famine of 1515 to 1322, when the sky then turned 22, when the sky against Europe's climate turns, cold rains, cold grain and rain, cold rare before the Black Death, before the plague carts and the mass graves, these graves, there came the famine. The Great Famine of 1315 turned was 18 at 13 to 22 was not caused by plague or war, but more fundamental and more terrifying in its implications. A catastrophic failure of the climate itself, beginning in the spring of 1315. Extraordinary sequence cold. Wet summers descend in northern Europe. Cold for grain to ripen, for harvest, too wet harvest to be gathered without persistent to be written off as a single bad year. For 7 consecutive years, when it was then average. Primitive harvest years, why thin margin of survival on which operated the climatic deterioration of the following century. It is understood by and climatologists as part of the beginning of the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long period lower average temperatures from approximately climate to approximately 200 to 850 to 1850. The specific events of 1315 to 1322 at the opening of this period, when the medieval warm period that had sustained European agricultural expansion for previous 3 centuries gave way abruptly and without warning to conditions that the existing agriculture was entirely unprepared to handle. The fields had been reclaimed from forest and marshed during the 12th century, and Mars that had been only because of the unusually almost nothing. The harvest failure of 1315 was severe, but not catastrophic. People drew on stored reserves, hoped that the following year would be better. It was not. The harvest of 1816 was worse than that of 13 and this year. And by the winter of 1316 to 1317, parts of northern Europe, particularly England, France, then the Low Countries, and the Germans and the German-speaking lands were in the grip of a famine of a severity that living memory could not match. Grain prices rose to levels that put beyond the reach of the poor. And sheep died, callen sipt goron, tim bodies from this one finest dawings to the grain harvest. The grain harvest. Salt, essential, result, beef, and scarce, and swiftly as the water is needed. From seawater. The human cost. Starvation on a continental scale, the human cost of the Great Famine. Modern estimates suggest died during the famine years. A figure that, while lower than the mortality of the Black Death that would follow 30 years later, represents an absolute number of deaths in the millions and level of suffering. Contemporary chronicles is it even meters. Pause. The sources describe people eating grass and roots. Describe consumption of this and dogs and cats and animals that were normally kept for work, companionship, doesn't. The eating of the bodies of the dead. Some sources go further and repealing the consumption of living children. Still, some show obsessed. At face value, the physical effects severe malnutrition, compounded by immune systems, typhoid, dysentery, and other infections. Red chillins, crowd spreads circumstance. Their resistance, inadequate nutrition, the combination of starvation and pattern to descend. The matters direct to this inequal record. but that produced a death toll that reshaped it in Northern Europe. In some English counties, the mortalities among during famine years were approached 20%. In parts of France and the Low Countries, the figures may have been higher. The social consequences of mass starvations extended its immediate death toll. The famine broke down social norms and incentives. Long-lasting effects. The church which the church was supplied was overwhelmed by the scale of the need. Its granaries, auxiliaries, and almshouses, adequate for normal levels were utterly insufficient in the face of affecting other things of the population. The nobility, who was sense unwilling was adequate assistance. The failure the front or the wisdom build in its portion incidents in ways that contribute the contributional and beliefs tension for 14th century. Chapter 4 The Mongol conquests. Storm from the east Genghis Khan on the Middle-East. Genghis Khan and the reshaping of the world, military catastrophe in medieval history approached the scale and speed of the Mongol conquests, the 13th century, beginning with Genghis Khan's unification of the Mongolian steppe tribes into Step 6. And continuing under his sons and grandsons for half-centuries. The Mafa century, the Mongol military machine swept across Eurasia from the Pacific coast to the Adriatic Sea, destroying cities, killing and reshaping the political map of the world more completely and more rapidly. Or since the demographic and cultural consequences of the Mongol quests were so severe that entire civilizations were effectively ended, agricultural systems were destroyed that took centuries to recover. And the trajectory of Eurasian history was permanently altered The scale of Mongol killing during the conquest period has been the subject of serious historical debates. Because the sources, both Mongol and the records of conquered peoples, are prone to both exaggeration and underestimate. For different reasons, the most careful modern estimates no, that's in the deaths. But if the flag. At the time, some regional estimates are even more staggering. Of Iran, devastated by repeated Mongol campaigns, may have fallen by as much as 2/3 between 2020 and 2020 to Western China to and 260. The population of China to perhaps 220 million in 200 to 260 million by 2090. Poland and Hungary by Mongol invasion in 41 to 141 to 2020. Lost between 30% of their population in the sea of a single year. The sack of Baghdad. The sack of Baghdad. Dates individual acts of destruction were the Mongol conquests. None is mark on the memory of Islamics of Baghdad in February in South Stocksville when Dult to aid February 58. Baghdad was in the mid-30s. Which had been the center of Islamic cultural life 5 centuries, and the home of the House Wisdom, the first knowledge. Repository of knowledge in the medieval world. Its population may have approached 1 million people. Its libraries, works in mathematics, astronomy, strategy, and literature. What glory is. It was in the Islamic world, the cities of cities. The Mongol general Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, arrived of Baghdad with an army estimated at between 150,000 soldiers, 50,000 and 850,000 soldiers in January 258. The Abbasid Caliph al-Muslim, apparently unwilling to believe that Baghdad could actually fall, refused and refused to mobilize this. The city's walls were breached within days, and on February 10th, 258, the Mongols entered Baghdad. What followed was 10 days of systematic destruction. Caliph was secured. Reportedly wrapped in a boarded carpet and carpeted in a carpet to avoid spilling of royal blood on the ground. Contemporary accounts describe the canals thrown into the water, and red the blood of scholars. The specific number of people killed in Dad has been estimated by various sources as 200,000 and 1,000 and 800,000. Almost certainly lies somewhere in this range, making it one of the single bloodiest events in the millenary period. The cultural loss it's chickens. Dr. Williams is genuinely difficult to calculate. The House of Wisdom had accumulated over 70 and the subjects that exist nowhere else in the world in their Arabic versions. Original works and cutting edge of human knowledge and historical and literary wordsworth preserve the memory of entire civilizations. Much of this was lost, forever. Islamic civilization, which had been dynamic, innovative in the world, the preceding 5 centuries, never fully recovered the trajectory of scientific and philosophical Kitarathrav interrupted. The invasion of Europe, 1241. In the spring of 1241, the Mongol general Badkhan, another grandson of Genghis, led a force of approximately 20,000 to 80,000 cavalry westward into Poland and Hungary in the most alarming military demonstration Europe had ever witnessed. The Mongol army split into European armies of a period unable to match. At the Battle of Legnica, on April 9, 1941, a combined force of Polish knights of Polish annihilated. Was annihilated. 2 days later, the Battle of Mohihi and Hoiri. Was forced to flee across the Danube and eventually to a fortified island coast in the space of 48 hours. The two primary eliminated. As fighting forces. The Mongol forces then bent out the countryside, devastating the with barely contained terror. Cities were burned. Agricultural infrastructure was destroyed. The population of Hungary before lost between 15 and 20% of its members in the single year of the popular pain. Comparable losses. Northern Anatolia, the Russian principalities, Bulgaria experienced similar devastation in the preceding and following years. Then, in the spring of 242, the Mongol army turned and withdrew eastward, never to return, and in the same force. The reason for this withdrawal has been debated by historians. The centuries. The death of the great Khan Ojidai in December 241, which required the return of Mongol princes to explanation. Whatever the reason, Europe was wearable of bone weight of Mongol now. Firebeard. Woman active. To have been a remarkable of luck. The catastrophe that had already occurred was severe enough. What might have been had the Mongol withdrawal not taken place when it did. It is one of the great counterfactuals medieval history. Chapter 5. The Great Schism. When Christianity part itself apart the papacy at Avignon of Trinilon. You have known the first of species from catastrophes of disease, or military destruction. Some of the most profound and lasting disasters of the medieval period were institutional. The collapse of authority and meaning had relied upon to make sense of their world, to organize their lives. The great schism of the Western Church, which lasted from 1378 to 1417 to 1417, was this catastrophe, a disaster, not of bodies, but of souls, not of crops and cities, but of faith and authority, that struck at the foundation of medieval European civilization. The crisis had its roots in the Babylonian captivity of the papacy period between 309 to 779, between 277 during papal court, during which the papal court resided not in Rome but in Avignon, in the south of France, under conditions that gave each French monarchy considered monarchs affairs. When Pope Gregory Pagari to Rome in 377 in 377 the following year triggered a crisis to its foundations. The conclave that met in Rome in 370 acted to an Italian pope, Urban's under circumstances of considerable pressure from the Roman crowd, who demanded a brilliant pope, or at least an Italian pope. Urban CI proved to be erratic, abusive, and possibly mentally unstable. And visited packed cardinals pregnant reforms for public written reform that would have dramatic the merit of the power of Cavalli as into and generally himself made himself in cardinals had elected him. The cardinal's response in motion, a fortune, a crisis. Declaring election invalid on the grounds that had been made under us. They elected a new pope, a Frenchman, Clement VII, who returned to Avignon, Europe, now each claiming to be the legitimate Saint Letter Kiev. Each excommunicating, and the other's supporters as ablots. Of all Christians, the division of Christendom along these lines is not random. Scotland, Ireland, Aragon, Aigle, and Castile, England, England, the Holy Roman Empire, Portugal, and most of Italy and Scandinavia supported the Roman Pope. The allegiances followed with remarkable constancy. The existing political fault lines of European politics, which was precisely what made the schism so damaging. Because it made clear to everyone that the church was not a political church, was not thoroughly, but thoroughly embedded in it. The Council of Constance and the burning of Jan Hus, the Council of Constance, which met for 414 to 418 to 418, was convened to resolve to resolve the schism and reform the church. And it succeeded in the first of these goals by to see the this they've 14 to 1317 had deposed the various claimants and elected a new universally recognized Pope Martin V. The councils of the Russell would fester for decades. The decades to interpret is in the freshness. A century later, Jan Hus, Boheme. Theologian, had been developing of a critique of church corruption and a theology that anticipated many of the positions would later make famous. He had been summoned to the council under a guarantee from the Emperor Sidious. Despite the imperial guarantee, Hus was arrested and burned and bloods July 6th, 115. His ashes were thrown into the Rhine to prevent his followers from preserving relics. The Emperor Sigismund's guarantee of safe conduct had been violated. A fact that both he and council acknowledged, but defended on the grounds that promises made to heretics were not binding. This reasoning, and the act it justified, triggered the Hussite War in Bohemia, a series of conflicts that lasts from 494 to 434 of a tour 34, and that made Bohemia ungovernable for a generation. The burning of Hus was not merely an act of religious persecution. It was the punishment that demonstrated the institutional church's inability to respond to response for reform without violence, and planted seeds of religious conflict that would grow over a century into the conflagration, the liberation, Reformation. Chapter 6. The 100 Years' War, a century of destruction of France burning. 31 burning, fluttering, 33 to 337 to 400, 45 to 51, 4 importantly, where's the 100 users and 53, 700 years between England and France, which lasted with interruptions from the 37 to 17 to 430, 53, 4 and 53, was not a single sticky three, was not a single catastrophic event, but a catastrophic vast frutnen korsböla och skimmer servant on the population and infrastructure of France were as devastating to the medieval period. The war combined trade, the wide scale, but construction had very clear static unconsidered. Invariably accompany prolonged armed conflict. Epidemic disease, spreading splits through maidens. And the disruption of agricultural production as peasants fled or were killed or at their crops seized, breakdown of trade, commerce, and this spend generations the military character of the Years' War was shaped by the English practice. United States declared countryside, specifically not play that is there a big deal? Not to capture territory, but to devastate it. The logic of the chevauchée was strategic. By systematically burning crops, destroying mills, killing livestock and placing the peasant population. The English aimed to undermine the economic and political power of the French crown, which depended on agricultural production. Its tax revenues and on a stable peasant population for its military manpower. The chevauchée was, in its essential character, and its civility lecture and repeated its execution across large areas of France. France produced a landscape of destruction that contemporaries compared to what they in the world would look like. The Black Princes swept through Languedoc from the Mediterranean to the Mediterranean, destroyed more than apartments and and 500 towns and villages along a path approximately 60 kilometers is wide and 600 kilometers long. Contemporary chronicles describe the smoke by the settlements. That's while some sense when trying things. I mean, countryside to friends for trying to walk the land. Black along wasteland, the long RPGs, old people, women and children, fleeing fleeing advancing English force. The objective was achieved. The French crown, the collapsed, and in was unable was slavery but damaged. Joan of Arc and the turning of the war by 1429, France was losing the war pensively. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled Paris and most of northern France. The Dauphin Charles, not yet Charles, and with his legitimacy was reduced to holding court south of the Loire. The city of Orleans, controls of Detroit, to remain held territory, was under siege. To fall in this moment of extreme crisis, a teenage girl from a village and arrived at Charles's court and announced God the dogs. Hear the coronation of the Dauphin. Joan of Arc's warrior, the Rolands, the May 1429, the Loire campaign that followed. The coronation of Charles Satias at Reims in July 1429. Transformed the trajectory of predicted her capture by the Burgundians in 1430. Her trial by an English-controlled court on charges of heresy and witchcraft, and her burning at the stake in ruin in May 1431 AD. Of approximately 19 gave the French a martyr whose symbolic power outlasted the specific military campaigns she had participated in. Charles Satu continued to prosecute the war with increasing Finnish 1530 had the English been expelled from all of Galiad. The 100 Years' War was over. having consumed a century, multiple generations of soldiers and civilians, and immeasurable human subsides. Both sides. Chapter 7. The Fall of Constantinople. Fall of Constantinople. 1273. Ascent of Rome. The Dome of Rome. The Land of Rome. The last day of an empire on the morning of an empire of May 29th of the morning of May 2020 of 2029, the city of Constantinople. The city of Constantinople, the greatest city in the Christian world, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire that had survived for 1,000 years, after the fall of the Western Empire, the repository of classical learning and Byzantine culture, of a city that is simple as if no other the Feldy that of the name fell to the Ottoman army, a Sultan Mehmed of 3 days. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine and Constantine Z. Palaiologos, reportedly and never found dying walls in the fighting and never found again. His body was identified only by the imperial eagles on his embroidered on his boots. The fall of Constantinople was not as a surprise. The Byzantine Empire had had a shadow of itself for well over a century before 403. Reduced by successive waves of Turkish conquest to little more than the city itself and a handful of territory. In Greece, the Ottoman Empire under Mehmed II was in the region, and the siege of Lentidon III and the siege was 53 of siege 53 was the culmination of a process of annexation that had been underway for decades. What made it a catastrophe of first magnitude event was not of the event, but its symbolic and practical consequence. The end of the last direct political continuity with the classical Roman world, the fall of everything married Christendom against Ottoman expansion and the civilization whose intellectual heritage would have consequences for in the West, Mehmed II's forces entered this area as they act on the night. After a night assault, the self-defenders. 3 days of looting followed, contemporary sources, both Western, describe the destruction of churches and the carrying off of their treasures, the enslavement, a significant of the city's remaining population, and the general devastation of the decades. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest Christian lot. This is and became the capital of the Ottoman Empire. The political consequences of the fall of Constantinople reverberated across and across the following century. The Ottoman advance into southeastern Europe accelerated, eventually breeze and to the gates of Vienna. 1529. In 29, the Eastern Christian churches and Leesfelds and Aden rather than teen suzerainty. A change whose consequences for their development would persist for centuries. And the scholars and fools the Italian states in the years before and after and in 454 before after during 53 brought with them grim manuscripts and Greek manuscripts and the knowledge of classical Greek language that was one of the catalysts of the Renaissance. Flowering that was, in part, the direct of a catastrophe. Chapter Height. The great earthquake of Iliton in 38. Of Emirate Aleppo destruction earth moves. Disasters in the medieval world. The medieval world was vulnerable, not honorable, man-made and biological disasters, and we have already examined, but to the full range of natural catastrophes that the earth periodically delivers without regard for the civilizations built upon it. Earthquakes, floods, and tsunamis, definitely worst ones. With far less warning, far less infrastructure for response, capacity for recovery. Among the natural disasters of the medieval period, for extraordinary toll, the York all northern Syria on October 11, 35. Mulka, Mimi in 38. The 138 estimated by modern seismologists to have had amplitude of approximately 8.885 on the Richter scale, a range that reflects the uncertainty inherent in estimating pre-instrumental earthquake magnitudes from historic records and geological evidence. Contemporary Arab chronicles horror that leaves little doubt about the scale of the catastrophe. The severely damaged was damaged. The force of Harim, 30 kilometers to the northwest. Entirely, the town of Zardana was completely destroyed. Contemporary sources figure towards 30,000 to 700,000 to 100,000. That modern historians treat appropriate skepticism that clearly reflect of enormous scale. The 138 earthquake was part of a sequence of seismic events that struck the region over the following years, including major earthquakes in 139 and 19 and 109 and 150. The region of northern Syria and southern Turkey sits above active zones that they presented into the Indian. The intersection of the Anatolian, Arabian and African and the medieval period along this fault system, the cumulative impact of these earthquakes on the already strained civilization, on the Crusaders and significant. The investor falling at this had been built at enormous cost, killing populations that could not easily be replaced, and disrupting agricultural and commercial systems on which earn life. The North Sea floods, while the earthquake struck the medieval Near East, Northern Europe faced its own recurring natural catastrophe in the form of floods from the North Sea and floods from the North Sea. The low-lying coastlines of are now the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark were home. From the sea through the construction of dikes and drainage systems. One of great engineering achievements of the medieval period. But this reclaimed land to the destructive power that stored forms. What we had overhead. Human biz and what had been taken from the sea. The St. Lucia's flood of this 287 is among the most destructive of these evil North Sea disasters. A severe storm surge that struck the coast of what is now the Netherlands and northwestern Germany, overwhelming dikes and floods and vast areas of low-lying land. Contemporary chronicles estimate deaths and in 50,000 in Germany alone. What is that? While perhaps reflect at a study mobilities it's transformative. The flood permanently altered the geography of the region, creating the Zuiden's inland Falcon, the Sealand Sea, that was parallel land, and this was descendants whose would spend subsistence with vengeance. Tinting it had been lost. What been lost? The great St. Elizabeth's flood of November and 1921 struck the same region with full force. An extraordinary storm drove north seaward, Farland, through the same vulnerable coastal areas. An estimated thousands, hunting to 100,000 people. Just people doing dozens of villages that were never rebuilt. The Biesbosch, in what the Netherlands, in the Netherlands on maps, this with small islands and small towns. The experience of watching the sea reclaim land that of ancestors had painstakingly drained and invaded of watching entire communities deep the water was as psychological as well as a physical catastrophe that was of the nations of the sea coast of the North Sea coast. Pop Don Chernaye. The Children's Crusade and disasters misplaced faith when belief became catastrophic world was one in which religious belief was one in which belief was myth, but its spirit of commitment but the fundamental framework through which it was understood, organized, and acted upon. The same faith that built the Gothic communities, and in certain also, yes, and censuses generated disasters, but sadly, catastrophes born of the collision between absolute religious conviction and the stubborn resistance of the material world to conform to its demands. The Crusades, the series of at capturing the Holy Land, are the most obvious examples of this phenomenon, but there are others. And among the most poignant is the episode that, let's say, in 2012 the Children's Crusade, or more precisely, the two mass movements of 12 is one of the and most heartbreaking episodes in medieval history. In the summer of 1112, two separate movements arose. One led by French shepherd Cloyes of Cloyes, and one led by Nicholas of Cologne, claiming divine inspiration for a crusade to recapture Jerusalem. The German movement, which was probably the larger, assembled a crowd estimated as 70,000, 30,000 people, predominantly young, predominantly poor, predominantly not soldiers, at Cologne, and marched south through the Alps toward Genoa, where Nicholas apparently that God would divide the Mediterranean Sea as he had divided the Red Sea for Moses, allowing to go to the Holy Land. The sea did not divide. Some of the crusaders that did not occur are from Genoese merchants. Contemporary sources record that 7 ships carrying the movement no survivors. The survivors of their neighbors were five saved with exclusive support members and their fabric. In North Africa, the ultimate of but most participants in both movements is unknown. which is itself a measure of the disaster. They vanished into the historical record with no resolution and no resolution and no resolution and no return. Having traveled from far from their homes on the strength of a conviction that the world did not reward. The flagellant movement, self-destruction is self-suffering. To speak out by feelings to take response of many hate. From increased piety and charity and by 2 days to summit, we have already discussed. Among the most dramatic and stern matters was the flagellant movement. Of trans and through them some parliament and written witchily and ripping in themselves in a collective active act of penance the heart and the plague. The flagellant movement was not new. It's in earliest of crisis, but an extraordinary intensity during the Black Death. During the Black Death, particularly in the German-speaking world, where organized bands of flagellants traveled for weeks or months, performing their ritual, self-punishment and public in front of assembled crowds. The spectacle of a flagellant procession was it's extraordinarily powerful emotionally. The processions typically arrived in hymns. And it's since themselves decided metal blends or the crowd while the crowd watched and says the procession, the emotional release and participation, the sense of doing anything in that offered no other avenue of meaningful action, clearly answered. Need. The movement spread with remarkable speed. Generating organized products, their own theology and their ownership structure that increasingly of the institutional church. Institutional church. Pope Clement VI condemned flagellant and movement in movement in October 1949. In October, seeing Ronald lighting the team raising the threat, rose to raising the threat, church and the danger that the movement's theology, which implied that personal penance could substitute penance for the substituted priests. represented to the institutional structure of Christianity. The condemnation, combined with the natural ebbing of the first wave, brought that movement into or two, but the underlying anxiety that generated it, the sense of a world subject, incomprehensible sastrally, divine punishment, that human action could not address, of institutions that failed utterly in their responsibility to protect the people they remained and would eventually find. Boom. Chapter 10. Minus abundant plus of supper maybe what get after cities made of wood. The modern fire hazard mazed medieval cities were fire traps, the combination of timber construction, thatched open hearths, and densely packed buildings, separated by narrow lanes, created conditions. In other words, clear even the single or dropped candle could produce a cough that was spectacular. It was an urban within hours. The historical record is punctuated with urban fires, catastrophic scale. Not because medieval people were careless or ignorant of the danger, but because the technologies available to build, heat, and cook in an environment where all been flame. We're all been flame, and because the building materials available for most of the population were combustible. The Great Fire of London of 1666 which most can name, had medieval respects equally devastating for the size of the cities they struck. London itself burned severely at least once, at least for in the famous a fire that started on the south bank of the Thames, spread to London Bridge, killed an estimated 3,000 people trapped on the bridge when both ends caught fire simultaneously. A disaster that drove the development of more robust stone construction in subsequent decades. The city of ruin, then one of the most affluent cities in northern France, must be destroyed by fire multiple times during the medieval. Cologne, Hamburg, and dozens of other major medieval cities experienced fires that destroyed significant portions of their built environment. The Great Fire of Novgorod and Eastern Russian were the most of Novgorod, one of the most important commercial and cultural center in Europe. Experienced a series of catastrophic fires during the medieval period that illuminated the visibility of northern European cities, primarily from Novgorod's fire records, preserved in the extraordinarily detailed Novgorod Chronicles, documented fires, main 30 fires in 1934 in my main to hang on a war for in London using 24 in man 44 guys at done 94 Zewers and moves in one Bruce who me 20 on me 2021 mu to synthesis set means into 91 me to 179 into 299 and on 21 sinful times into the 14th and 17th and 15th centuries, and fictitious from images of age, mere catastrophic fire every feet, fire feet is aeons of fleet destroyed each of which destroyed large sections of the city and killed hundreds of people. The one to on that 11 fire, burning a large of the city, including several quarters of the cathedral quarter. The chronicle records, but the Dracula. Rather fluctuates with the reference in writing. It notes the number of chis burned, the displacement, the ability, and to which began what it cannot fully convey. What the repeated frequency of these disasters instances is the Assad capability of is the original in one's image of one's home, one's accumulated possessions, and potentially one's life was a routine and expected not a once-in-a-generation catastrophe recurring. But the occurrence which once up chapter 11 the witch trials, terror diesel violence, the symmetric and exclusive and persimmons is the most commonly in the popular imagination with the early modern period, the 16th and 17th saints where its roots lie deep in the medieval period. And its most and a devastating episode that occurred within the village of the Middle Ages. The theological and legal was made the 14th during the 13th and 14th centuries. Driven by the same anxieties about divine punishment and demonic conspiracy, the Black Death that edge to their most pitch. The witch trials of 15th century. Particularly of Austria, Switzerland, and southern Germany, seen approximately and 20 and 120 and 490 and 120 and 490 represent the first large-scale systematic persecution of people specifically for the crime of diabolism. The making of a pact with the devil for participation in the Sabbath, and the exercise of magic against neighbors and communities. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum in Ontalam, though Hondan in 1447, at the deity of it, by Dominican inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger synthesized the existing theological and legal tradition into a comprehensive manual for the prosecution of witches that would influence the conduct of witch trials for 2 centuries. Its explicit and detailed misogyny, its argument that more susceptible to diabolical influence than men helps explain why the overwhelming majority of those tried and executed for it were women. The social dynamics of which about communities responded as restrained as later society, which accusations tended to communities that experienced significant epidemics, crop failure, livestock mortality, infant deaths, whose cause could not be otherwise explained. The accusation of a neighbor as a witch, the community gay is specific. Schoolets, for an anxiety that was otherwise directed at the Ayin and the divine. The accused were typically marginal individuals. Old women living alone. Women, reputations for unusual knowledge or behavior. Women who had previously made enemies, whose Social vulnerability made them targets, and whose deaths satisfied the community's need for action without threatening its core social. Chapter 12: The Survival of Civilization. Lessons from medieval fears. Fact, love, desire, we have journeys dying disasters that the medieval world endured plague and famine, conquest, lyticism, earthquake, fire, and faith-driven. The cumulative weight of catastrophe might suggest a picture of the Middle Ages as simply 1,000-year intervening a dark valley between the achievements of classical Renaissance and the Renaissance. But this would be a profound misreading of the evidence. It would give grave injustice to the people who lived through these events. This terrestrial piece no catastrophe is not the scale of the disasters, but the persistence of recovery. After the Black Death killed 1/3 or more of population, the survivors rebuilt. After the Mongol quests, civil ruins, on the ruins. After the greater community, stud communities, the noobs, and the new crops made famines, floods, somewhat less likely. Less folly. A fall of Constantinople. The displaced scholars of Byzantium carried their learning to Italian cities. The Renaissance. Disaster and recovery were non opposites. They were partners in a dialectic that, over the long run, produced genuine progress, even through episodes of catastrophic regression. The mechanisms of recovery reveal important truths about the resilience of medieval civilization. Communities that recovered most effectively, strong social grids, strong social bonds that held even under the stress of disaster, flexible institutional structures that could adapt, that same service the practical knowledge that was distributed across the community rather than concentrated in an individual's, and a framework of meaning something religious, sometimes secular, that gave people away awareness and some randomness. These are not medieval characteristics. They are fierce, resilient human communities in any era. The disasters of the Middle Ages also produced, in some cases, the conditions, the human condition, the labor shortage created by the Black Death of the labor-saving technologies. Productivity, the collapse of the institutional church on spirituality, accelerated out of the great sellers, failures during the plague years created the conditions for the theological questioning that eventually produced the Reformation, and through it, the broader tradition of intellectual inquiry that we associate. The fall of Constantinople brought the West. He contributed to the West. The disasters were real. And they're paid in suffering of a kind on a scale we should never minimize or romanticize. But they were not merely destructive. They were also complicated in some ways of narrative. The human capacity for enduring endurance, what ultimately defines the history of medieval disaster, is not the disasters themselves, but the human response to them. The medieval people who survived the Black Death, buried dead and rebuilt communities of were victims of force and their control. They were active agents who, within the very real limits, by our world's free choices, made and actions that determined became extinction, or merely terrible suffering from which recovery was possible. Their choices were often wrong. Their explanations were almost always incorrect, and as to the they faced. But they persisted. The mother who buried 3 children in the plague someday 13.8, at the 1348, and then the following spring, planted her fields again. The merchant who rebuilt his warehouse destroyed his city's waterfront. The who copied manuscripts in a monastery threatened by approaching armies. The peasant farmer who at the 7th consecutive year of failed harvests, year's crop. These are the people whose stories the historical record most historically does not preserve. Because history in the Middle Ages, as written by the educated and powerful, not by the anonymous majority, whose endurance was the actual foundation medieval civilization stood. We know they existed because civilization continued. We're planet. We're chubbied. The children that were educated. Of some of the cathedrals, some of which to build were eventually completed. This persistence in the face of scales on a scale that modern people in the developed world have never experienced is own ways, quiet way, in its own quiet way. One of the most of our species. Were real. The people, them, extraordinary, epilogue. The lessons of what the dead teach the living standing through the and cheerful through the most inclusive of the medieval world. It is tempting draw the content of that world. The modern world has left this kind of catastrophe behind. That our medical knowledge, our agricultural productivity, capability, and our institutional resilience have raised us above the vulnerability made disasters. This conclusion premature the diseases that caused medieval epidemics. They have merely been contained by medical and public health system. By medical and public health systems whose fragility has demonstrated has landed with uncomfortable clarity. The climate change that is currently the systems is certain respects, directly analogous to the climatic panic that triggered the Great Famine, the political and religious divisions that had served their contemporary that remains divided along ideology and faith. What the history of medieval catastrophe most clearly teaches is not inability of the disaster, but the abilitingness of the continent that determine whether disaster becomes extinction or may pour terrible suffering from which is possible. The resilient communities that recovered from the Black Death and the Great Famine were not by accident. They were because they were resilient because they had over generations built the social bonds, the practical knowledge, and the institutional flexibility that made collective survival possible under conditions of extreme stress. These are the same conditions that determine and face the challenges of our own time. The medieval dead for surviving catastrophe, but they have left us the record of their experience. Incomplete, fragmented, often mediated through the distorting lens of the educated and the acquired. And that record, read carefully with humility, has things to say about the human condition that no other source can fully replicate. They face the worst that a medieval world the medieval world provided, and many of them survived. Their survival, theirs that were here. Their story is, in a very real sense, our story. And it is not yet finished.